Yeah. Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining our webinar. I'm Eric Lukens. I'm OBI's Communications Director. A couple of housekeeping things before we get started. We are recording the webinar, and we'll post it on OBI's website for anyone who wasn't able to attend. We've also scheduled an hour to allow plenty of time for questions, but we might not need all of it. And if we don't, we'll just end early. Sarah will take questions during her presentation as well as afterwards. So if you have a question at any point, just ask in the chat. I think you use the Q&A function. You can see that at the bottom of the Zoom screen. And we're here to talk today about Oregon's performance on nationwide standardized tests and the apparent disconnect between educational outcomes and school funding. Last month, results of the 2024 National Assessment of Educational Progress were released. And Oregon's results on 3 of the 4 tests were worse in 24 than in 2022, when they were among the nation's lowest. This drop in performance happened despite a steady increase in recent years in K through 12 funding. So to help us make sense of this, we're fortunate to have Sarah Pope with us today. Sarah is Executive Director of Stand for Children Oregon, which works to ensure that every student in Oregon has equitable access to a world-class public education. Sarah started with Stand for Children in 2005 and served in various roles before leaving in 2012 to become Chief of Staff for the Oregon Department of Education's first appointed state superintendent. She left ODE in 2015 to become Executive Director of Instruction and then Deputy Superintendent at the Northwest Regional Education Service District, which serves more than 100,000 students. While serving with the ESD, Sarah received her Master's in Education Leadership from the U of O, as well as her K through 12 administrative license. So suffice it to say that Sarah knows a thing or two about public education. We're lucky to have her here today. And with that, I'll stop talking and hand things over to you, Sarah.
Oh, well, thank you so much, Eric. It's always fun to hear what people choose around my bio. So I appreciate the background. And also, I recognize some of the folks in the webinar. So it's great to at least your name, Courtney, and Hans, and Janine, and others. So thanks so much for joining us on this cold and wet day in February. So like Eric said, I am going to kind of put in context what we just learned about through the NAEP release that came out last month. And I'm happy to take questions as they come. And like Eric said, we'll also have plenty of time for discussion afterwards. So please don't be shy about asking. I think that will keep it more interesting for everybody. So Eric's going to monitor the chat. I am also just going to see if I can get back to the chat so I don't miss anything. And then away we go. So here's our mission statement at STAND very briefly. We're a unique catalyst for education equity and racial justice to create a brighter future for us all. My bio, as Eric said, I'm the ED of Stand for Children Oregon, and I am going to jump into the problem. So the data that just came out is NAEP data. This is often referred to as our National School Report Card. So unlike our state assessment data, what NAEP does is it samples kids from every state in the country so that we can get an apples to apples comparison in at least 4th grade and 8th grade English language arts and math. So those are the tested subject areas that the sampling of kids from every state take. And it's the only test that does this, that measures achievement across the country, which is why it's called the nation's report card. And here's a couple of sample questions. These are from the 4th grade test. So one on the ELA, just to give you a sense of the sorts of things that 4th graders were asked about. They're asked about comprehension. So this question, in the poem, the old man and the speaker have different feelings about the toads. Explain the difference using the information from the poem. So obviously it's not just, can you read the passage, but can you read a passage and then comprehend the passage and answer those questions. This is a 4th grade question, a math question. Which of the following numbers are even and which are odd? And then the student is asked to drag each number into a box to show their answer, those that are even and those that are odd. So that's a little bit of context for NAEP. I'm now going to turn to how Oregon students did relative to the rest of the country. So for reading, or for English language arts, as you see, we are at the bottom. Now, this isn't adjusted for demographics or anything. This is just how does Oregon fare compared to the rest of the country. In fourth grade reading, there were 3 states that did worse than us. We were tied with Oklahoma, but near the bottom, obviously, in reading. Same in math. So we can kind of set aside Puerto Rico for a second. Third worst in math. This is in fourth grade as well. And then when you jump to so I'm going to tell you what I'm going to jump to next. So that's just how does state by state comparisons do. Now, when you look at adjusted for demographics, so the Urban Institute takes a look at poverty, racial demographics, and then puts us on a chart to see how do we do relative to the rest of the country. And I think this is the one that's really, really, really alarming. So when you look at our reading scores in fourth grade, adjusted for demographics, Oregon does absolutely worse. And when you look at the states that are doing the best, we have Mississippi, Louisiana, Florida, Massachusetts. These top 3 states, Mississippi, Louisiana, and Florida, are always pretty surprising to folks that they're outperforming the rest of the country on reading. And we can talk a little bit about why, but in light of the focus that they've had on literacy, and it's really been a statewide focus, it's actually not surprising that they're doing well. And I think the main point here is that when a state decides to focus on something and then supports that focus over time, kids do better. And we're seeing that in the data here with fourth grade NAEP. When you look at math, same deal. So adjusted for demographics, Oregon is at the bottom. And again, some of the same states. So remember I mentioned Louisiana, Texas, and Mississippi. I'm sorry, I didn't mention Texas. I said Louisiana, Florida, and Mississippi. We also have Texas in the top here. So and when you get to 8th grade, similar deal. So we're not the very last in 8th grade, we're 4th from the bottom. And then when we get to math, it's very similar as well, 4th from the bottom. So that's how Oregon students did in the NAEP that they just came out. And I'm gonna turn a little bit to the overlay of the NAEP results with funding. But I just wanted to pause for a second. Eric, I don't see anything coming through the chat, but I just wanted to give people a minute if there are any questions about that context for what is NAEP and then how did Oregon do. So happy to take any questions if there are any. Eric, are you seeing any in the chat so far?
No, there's nothing in the chat.
Okay. So feel free to put anything in there if you have any questions. Otherwise, I will get to the context of how are we doing relative to funding too. Did you want to say something, Eric?
No, I just figured I'd turn my camera on.
There you go. It's nice to look at somebody. It is weird with the webinar because I don't get to see people's faces, so it's nice to see yours, Eric. Okay, so similar timeline. The NAEP data came out at about the same time that Dr. Marguerite Rosa from Edunomics was asked to come present to the House, the Joint Ways and Means Committee on Education. And she brought some data that we've been aware of and we had been looking at as well, but she put it on a statewide spotlight. And so this is the data that she shared. So you'll see Oregon's NAEP data is the orange and the blue line. So since 2013, we've been falling pretty steadily. So steadily falling in reading and then steadily falling in math. And at the same time, our per pupil funded level or spending has actually been rising pretty significantly. So prior to 2013, we were below the national average in funding. And then starting in the last decade, we've now met and a little bit exceeded the national average in spending per child, as our NAEP data, both in reading and in math, has been falling. And you could really plot pretty much any student outcome data and you'd see the same trend line. So we could plot attendance and we'd see the same trend line. The one exception would actually be high school graduation, which I'm going to talk about here in a minute, has been rising a little steadily, but pretty much everything else has been falling. So the point that Dr. Rosa made is actually to Oregon's Ways and Means Committee, what are you spending your money on if these are what's happening on the outcome side of the house?
We do have a question in the Q&A.
Yeah, go for it.
It is, when I mention these figures to fellow Oregonians, there is often a question that follows the initial shock. Why? Given that Oregon spends more per pupil than many states, what are some reasons that could be contributing to this? What impact might the shorter school year in Oregon have on these results?
Yeah, it's a really important question. So a couple thoughts about why. Like I said, the states that you see outperforming both the national average, but obviously outperforming Oregon, have had a really strong statewide focus on literacy. And so Florida has done that, Mississippi has done that, Louisiana has done that. And Oregon, we just started with SANS advocacy, which many of you helped with. We just started legislation in 2023 to create a statewide focus around literacy, but we hadn't had one before. So, the amount of sort of leadership that a state will take has a really significant contributing factor to the outcomes on kids. So I would point to that as issue number one. Issue number two is we have a lot of school districts in Oregon relative to our size. So we have close to 197, which means our average school district is about 1,000 kids. And you compare that to Florida, which has millions of more kids than we do, and they have 40 school districts. So when Florida's trying to roll something out, they have 40 different jurisdictions that are in charge of rolling it out. When Oregon's trying to roll something out, we have close to 200 different jurisdictions rolling something out. So the lack of a real statewide focus and then the amount of local small districts that are trying to do it alone really contributes to the volatility in their student outcomes. Those are two really significant things. People will talk about opt-out in Oregon as a contributing factor to why we fare so poorly, but I really want you to sort of pull that apart in your head around this NAEP data, because you don't opt out of NAEP. As I was saying, it's a sampling of kids across the entire country. So it's not that we have students opting out of NAEP and that's causing our data to be lower than it should be. And to the point that was also in the question about the length of our school year, that's a significant, I hypothesize, we're going to do a little bit more analysis on this, that Oregon's short school year is another significant contributing factor to our low student performance. Now, I said that's a hypothesis right now. We are going to do a little bit more analysis of that shortly, but we about 100 on average and 70 days in Oregon. The national average for the school year length is 180, which means most kids around the country are going to school 2 weeks longer than kids in Oregon. And the other piece I would overlay on that, not just the school year length, but we have really high rates of chronic absenteeism. So when you look at Oregon short school year with high rates of kids missing 10% or more, that has a significant impact on Oregon's outcomes. We're, like I said, going to do a little bit more research around what's the compounding nature of our short school year and our high rates of chronic absenteeism. I hypothesize that it's very significant, but I would love to come back when we get that data and share it with everybody.
Okay, we have one more question.
Yeah.
Given our high number of school districts relative to other states, how is that impacting the funding that gets down to the classroom versus paying for administrators?
That's a good question. The administrative overhead is not, I don't see that as a huge significant factor. I see the big problem, the larger problem with having close to 200 school districts is that we have 200 different systems trying to roll out an initiative. So the vast majority, and I think this person's getting at it, the vast majority of a school budget is spent on people. Obviously, education is a person-heavy profession. Within education, then the teachers and the classified staff tend to be the vast majority of the district's budget. So it is true with 197 districts, we're going to have more administrators, obviously, than Florida that has 40 school districts. But my analysis of what's causing the low performance relative to the rest of the country is that we just have so many places trying to figure it out on their own, and we don't have a strong sort of direction from the state to support that implementation. Oh, we got you muted, Eric. Oh, you're still muted.
Sorry about that.
Okay.
Is there a correlation between year-round school and outcomes?
Oh my gosh, I wish I was doing this in like another month or so. Yes, because we're going to have the data about the school year length. Generally, the more time kids get in school, the better they do, right? That's sort of general. And so if you're going year round, generally you're going to do better, especially because what we see happen is kids do, decently well during the school year, and then there's a significant summer slide, right? When you have a big break in time where you fall back. I mean, I think we remember that as children, or we've seen that in our own children. And then it takes a while to get caught back up again. So yes, the more consistent the calendar, the longer the calendar, the more kids who attend regularly, that all has a significant impact on student achievement. My colleague did do an analysis just looking at Oregon's short school year. So, right, I said we're about 170 days. If you're a student in Oregon who's chronically absent, compounded with our short school year, by the time you finished fourth grade, you will have missed almost 3/4 of a year of school relative to the national average. So those things compound, right? Our shortened year compounded by being chronically absent means kids in Oregon are getting a lot less school. And we know the data when kids are chronically absent, they're not reading at high rates. I forget off the top of my head, but I think it's like a 20 percentage point difference. So on average in Oregon, about 40% of our kids reach our state proficiency level. If you're chronically absent, about 20% are reaching that state proficiency level. So it's a significant compounding nature, our high rates of absenteeism, our short school year on this data. Is there anything else, Eric, before I get into
Nope.
that? Okay.
That's it for now.
Okay, keep the questions coming. That makes it really much more interesting, I think. So here's the data that Dr. Marguerite Rosa presented. And I should say we also had Echo Northwest do a similar graph for us. And this was about a year or so ago because there was another data set that came out well, it was January last year. So as states were starting to come out of the pandemic, Harvard and Stanford did an analysis and they looked at which states are rebounding. So whose students are rebounding post-pandemic, and Oregon again was at the bottom. So this wasn't looking at this most recent NAEP data because it hadn't happened yet, but it was looking at NAEP data from the years of the pandemic and then state assessment data from 2023. And Oregon again was at the very bottom in literacy and close to the bottom in math. And when I was talking to the researchers, specifically Thomas Kane out of Harvard, he said, you know, it's really interesting. I've been looking at your data and Oregon, you have been falling since 2013. It's not like you just fell during the pandemic. I mean, everybody saw this fall, right? When you're looking at this graph from 2019 to 2021, everybody saw this significant fall due to the pandemic. But what you'll see is prior to the pandemic, we were falling. And when I was talking to Dr. Keene out of Harvard, he said, you really did start falling in 2013. So you had this stretch from 2013 to 2019 of decline. Then you had the steep decline during the pandemic. And then what's happening is some states then are starting to rebound since the pandemic, and this line is now coming back up. But in Oregon, we're actually continuing to fall. So that's, you know, compounding the problem here in Oregon. So what can we do about it? I'm going to juxtapose this school funding picture that we just talked about, which is just the general state school fund. So money that goes into schools, most of it doesn't have strings attached to it. Each of those 197 school districts spend it in whatever way they want. We're obviously a heavily local controlled state. Juxtaposed to a measure that Stand actually passed with some of you, I see Courtney on this call, called High School Success in 2016. And in this legislation, it was a ballot measure that we passed. We said, okay, $150 million a year is going to get earmarked to supporting high school students. And you can only spend the money in research-aligned strategies. And those research-aligned strategies are supporting ninth graders, doing career technical education, and dual credit. So getting kids college credit while they're in high school. The ballot measure passed in 2016. It was fully funded in 2019. And here's what's happened with our high school graduation rates. So you'll see kind of the same time frame. We actually probably should have gone back to 2013, but I can, spoiler, I can tell you what happened in 2013. Here's where we started when ballot measure 98 passed. And here's what's happened with high school graduation. So we're now, for the all student groups, we're close to 82% are graduating. About a decade, well, in 2016, we were at 76.7%. And the orange line are Black African American students who started at 67%, now it's 75%. For our Latino students, started at 72.5%, now close to 79%. So our only indicator that's been rising as pretty much everything else is falling has been this high school graduation rates. And we obviously attribute a lot of that back to these research-aligned strategies that were funded through the High School Success Act. And we're not the only one. So when the high school graduation data came out again last month, it was a busy release last month, it was pointed out that the state's big bet, this is out of the Oregonian article, the state's big bet on expanding career technical education, which is one of the three strategies you could do with the Measure 98 money, which was driven largely by us, has paid off in spades. So students, the approximate 1/3 of high school seniors who are career technical education concentrators, meaning they took at least 2 years worth of courses in career technical ed, graduated at not just the state average, but close to 100%, 98%. And then similarly, the Secretary of State audited for the ballot measure. We had an audit every couple of years. They just audited the High School Success Act. And they said that the Oregon Department of Education, the high school success grants have expanded important programs. And then they also found that ODE can do more to identify and share effective strategies. So I lay this out kind of to compare to what's been happening on our reading and math, which until 2023 has had no statewide focus. And you compare that to what we saw with high school success, which we created a statewide focus in 2016, and we have seen student outcomes around high school graduation steadily increasing. And this point, I think, is an important one because I talked about Louisiana and Mississippi, the states that are doing far better than Oregon and the rest of the country around literacy have had a really strong state Department of Education supporting implementation. And what the Secretary of State called out in the most recent audit on high school success is that, yes, high school success is working to expand these high quality programs that are serving kids better, but ODE can do more to identify and share effective strategies. So we need to be more like what Mississippi and Louisiana and Florida are doing in terms of supporting implementation. So I use high school success as a bright spot, and I want to talk a little bit about what we're doing now to address literacy specifically. But I just want to pause, Eric, if there are any questions about that, that last piece that I just.
None yet.
Okay. So similar to the way high school success was structured, right? So we said outside of the state school fund, here's $150 million a year. You can only use it for research-aligned strategies. We wrote a piece of legislation in 2023 that did a very similar thing for literacy. So we looked at first, what does the research say? We wondered, what are the most effective ways to improve early literacy long-term? We worked with researchers at the University of Michigan, and the data is really clear. You want to do literacy coaching for educators. You want to do home and school-based summer programming for kids. Remember the question that somebody had in the audience, like what happens during summer? Kids tend to slide and lose ground. And then you want to do high dosage tutoring for students, which is actually something that a handful of states like Tennessee have really doubled down on and have seen outcomes improve as a result. So these are the three cost-effective, research-aligned ways to get kids accelerated around their literacy. Obviously, the implementation needs to be research-aligned and culturally responsive. Using this research, we wrote House Bill 3198. Now, we don't write it, Legislative Council writes it, but we put in the House bill that this money that gets allocated through 3198 can only go to the things that you see on that list. So professional development and coaching for teachers, extended learning programs for kids, high dosage tutoring. And we also said districts could adopt research-aligned curricula and supporting materials. So this was the piece of legislation that we worked on in the last long session. We costed out what would it take to do that statewide. So if we wanted all kids who needed tutoring to get tutoring, all kids who needed summer learning to get summer learning, all teachers to be able to get coaching, districts to be able to do curriculum updates, it costs about $300 million a biennium, $150 million a year. We were successful in getting about a third of that, about 100 million of it dedicated in 2023. And we're working actively right now to get the full 300 million earmarked for this purpose. So similar to the high school success work, right, which is money that sits outside of the state school fund, districts could only access it to do these research-aligned strategies. We're doing the same thing on the literacy side. But again, about 1/3 of the needed money was allocated in 23. I want to turn a little bit to like why some of these states that have been effective, you don't just pass the legislation, you obviously have to support its implementation. I'm going to turn to that next, but before I do, I'm just going to pause, Eric, and see if there was anything that needed to be attended to.
Nope, no questions yet.
So like I said, the first wave of funding for the early literacy work, House Bill 3198, was passed in 23. So districts, this will be the first year that we've had a little bit of a statewide focus around literacy. we were really nervous because of the Secretary of State's audit around what the department needed to be doing more of. We were really nervous to just sort of let the department implement early literacy alone and not be involved as an advocacy organization in supporting that implementation. So we decided to do, from legislation to the classroom, we were going to launch something called demonstration sites. So we chose 13 elementary schools across the state as proof points that accelerated literacy outcomes are possible. And we have put them in a network with each other. We've given them access to a researcher and we've given them access to a coach. And we're following them the course of this year to see what happens with their literacy outcomes in their early grades. So when that data is available, I'll share it with you. These are the schools. So they're serving a combined total of about 5,000 children. They're mostly, and obviously that's half of the state, but from Rosa Parks and MLK up in Portland, all the way down to Klamath Falls in Southern Oregon. And that is the focus of our work as we head into the next year as well. So as we're going to be advocating for the full 300 million dedicated to research-aligned, more accountable funding for education, we're also planning on supporting its implementation through schools as they work to implement that legislation. So I was just going to turn a little bit to what you can do if you're so inclined, but I would love to open it up more broadly. I know it's a little bit clunky with the webinar, but discuss with, take any other questions and see if there's anything else hanging out there before closing.
Yep, there is one question. How are they measuring their outcomes? SBAC or something else?
How are we through the demonstration schools?
I think so, yes.
Oh, gotcha. Yeah, so SBAC is this SBAC, right, which is our state assessment. So it's different than NAEP, which we've been talking about. But yes, these schools are going to we're looking at SBAC, which is only done once a year in third grade. So that is an important data set, but it's not the only data set. We're also doing, we're analyzing their interim data. So a lot of them are using interim assessments like iReady or MAPS. So we're analyzing that data. We just got a big data dive at the midpoint of the year. And then we're also doing a writing sample. So we had all first graders that are in the network do a writing sample last year and then first graders this year. And we're scoring that writing sample with a rubric. And then we're also looking at the fourth data we're looking at is how adults in the schools using a rubric are their practices aligning more and more and more to the research. Because one would anticipate, right, that if teachers are following the research-aligned strategies, there should be an uptick then in how students are doing around literacy. So we're looking at those four things: adults in the building and their actions relative to the research. We're looking at writing data of first graders. We're looking at the district's interim data using something like MAPS or iReady, and then we will look at third grade SBAC. All right. So I think I saw a couple other folks join. Gosh, I wish we could all just like end up in a conversation together. I know that's not the point of a webinar, but I would love it because I think there's a lot of people on here with some really informed, I'm sure, perspectives and also questions. But I guess I would leave with this. Change is totally possible in Oregon. About a decade ago, nobody thought, well, I shouldn't say nobody thought. About a decade ago, we saw Mississippi was performing about the worst in the country around literacy. And it was sort of like, well, thank God for Mississippi because at least, you know, Oregon's outperforming Mississippi. Well, Mississippi started about a decade ago really investing deeply in the way kids are learning to read. And there's some information out there that, well, the reason that Mississippi's doing so well is they went deep in something called the coaching that I mentioned that's in our bill too, which is coaching of educators around updating their practices to align to the research to teach kids to read. And you saw in the data, right, Mississippi is now way outperforming Oregon and actually outperforming the rest of the country. There's other states that have done different things in Mississippi. They didn't do coaching, but they did tutoring, for instance. So Tennessee went really deep in tutoring during the pandemic, and their students are also outperforming Oregon. I say that because it is possible for Oregon to get better, but we have to be explicitly focused around research-aligned strategies, and we have to spend our funding on those strategies. And we can't leave it to chance, right? We can't leave every district on their own trying to figure it out. We have to have a state direction, we have to have clear research, and we have to support implementation. And when we do that, we will increase. And I will argue we will increase just like we did with high school graduation. We can increase with literacy and we can increase with math. But we absolutely have to be aligned to the research, have a statewide focus, attend, connect the funding to that spending, and then have really, really strong implementation. There's a bunch of
Got a couple more. Good.
around
We have
this.
a couple more questions.
Yeah, go for it.
This one is, I came in late, so maybe I missed this, but have we found any area where we think funding could be diverted from, from programs that aren't working to this concept? And I think it was the statewide literacy pilot. Since we are on the high side of per student funding, obviously something is not working.
Yeah. So we're looking at all funding mechanisms. I would say, and since this is the OBI membership, and many of you are actively paying the corporate activity tax, which funds the Student Success Act. I really do think the Student Success Act is an important piece of legislation that does need to be better aligned to student outcomes. And so that's a pot of money. It's about $1 billion a year. It was initially established kind of similar to high school success with the idea was have some research aligned strategies that districts are spending money on. But the amount of things that districts can do within the Student Success Act are so broad. You really can spend that $1 billion a year on pretty much anything. And when you look at what's happening with student outcomes, it hasn't moved the dial statewide on anything, really. I mean, our attendance rates have been falling, our literacy rates have been falling, our math rates have been falling. And so I quickly get to the Student Success Act as an important funding mechanism in Oregon that could be strengthened to better align to things like early literacy.
Okay, got a couple more. Are other states working with their teacher training programs or coaching teachers after they are hired?
Yeah, I'm glad somebody asked that. So yes, some states are doing that. When Stanford Children championed that legislation in 23 around early literacy, the governor did have a work group that she formed around teacher prep. And so there are new standards. Our teacher prep programs are supposed to align to those new standards here in a couple of next year, so that teachers coming out of Oregon teacher prep programs are better able kind of to teach kids to read, that they're prepared in a way that aligns to the research so that they don't have to get retrained when they get to a district. That work is underway. It is not finished yet. And there's also, I always get nervous in Oregon because there's not been yet a strong focus on that implementation. There are some states that have gone down that path and are far better preparing educators. Colorado comes to mind as sort of a leader in the pack in that work. One of the other pieces, well, I'm going to pause for a second, see if there's other questions, but I am very interested, similar to kind of the length of the school year and our attendance rates. I'm really interested in, can we connect better our teacher prep institutions with our school districts? There are examples, Illinois does this, Ohio does this, where teacher prep candidates are the tutors for the children who need acceleration. And the only institution that does this at any kind of scale in Oregon is an institution, it's Eastern Oregon University out east, led by Rhonda Fritz. And I'm interested in seeing if we can replicate and grow what Rhonda in Eastern Oregon is doing, because we have so many kids who need tutoring. We have about 25,000 kids that didn't reach that third grade benchmark in literacy last year. Those kids need to get caught up before they leave elementary school. If we don't get them caught up before they leave elementary school, it's really hard for them to ever get caught up. And so we have about 7, if I'm remembering correctly, higher ed institutions, public ones that are preparing teacher prep candidates. Well, those teachers are they're in the process of becoming teachers. They could be tutors for the 25,000 kids that are currently need some acceleration in literacy. So we are actively looking at what would it cost to stand up both a pilot, but also a full-blown model where those students receive tutors, because it also better prepares the teacher prep candidates to be teachers, right? And like I said, Maryland is doing this, Ohio, Illinois, Washington, D.C. is doing this. And it's a pretty powerful strategy to better link up what higher ed institutions are doing with school districts and get a really needed support to kids.
Okay, here's another one. Math outcomes, as you've shown, are also awful. Are there efforts at the state level to address that?
Yeah, I am not aware of any concentrated efforts like I am obviously with the work that we're leading with literacy. I am also really worried about math outcomes. I would say the thing about math outcomes is kids can get caught up in math faster. They can get faster generally than research shows they can get caught up in literacy. And if we can get them caught up in literacy, they obviously can access math at higher rates too. But no, there's not a concentrated effort in the way that there is with literacy, and we need a statewide focus around that as well. And I should just say the reason is when you think about learning how to read, there's so much prior knowledge you need to bring to have strong literacy comprehension. So you could teach a kid how to sound a word out, which we need to do more and more and more and better of. But in order to ensure that kids are comprehending what they read, they also need to have really great vocabulary, and they need to understand how you build a book. They need to understand how a story develops and character development, and be able to understand what they're reading. And that requires a lot of prior knowledge, which is why it's harder to get caught up in literacy than it is in math. With math, if there's a hole that's emerged that a student needs filled, you can generally fill the hole and then off the student goes to progress around math again. So not to say we shouldn't focus on math, we absolutely need to. It's just that if or when we do focus on math, we should see that acceleration. Is there anything else there?
None, but if there's a gap, I'll throw in a question. You mentioned as I guess causes or problems, the fact that we don't have a strong state leadership and also a high absentee rate. Is there also resistance in any place in Oregon to the sorts of things that we need to do?
Yeah, that's a good question. Yes, there is resistance. And I would say because we have 197 districts trying to figure it out on their own, they're encountering that resistance on their own, right? And so every district then is trying to encounter and respond to that resistance, as opposed to the state saying, here's an example of what Tennessee did during the pandemic. They said, you're going to have a lot of flexibility, Tennessee, with these federal dollars that came through. Every state got federal dollars. Oregon got some. I'll show you what happened with ours here in a minute if you want. Tennessee's federal dollars came through and they said, you know what? With 80% of the money, you can do whatever you want with it. But with 20%, we're all going to double down on literacy tutoring together. That created an opportunity where then there wasn't a lot of pushback at the local level because the state was like, we're all doing this thing together. And then it didn't set up each individual district to try to respond to that pushback. It both creates a focus and also gives districts cover to do the right work for kids. And here in Oregon, when we don't have that, we just sort of leave 197 districts to try to figure it out on their own. And it just is a recipe for performance, I would say. I did, because I alluded to the federal thing a couple times, this is the data that Harvard and Stanford, the analysis that Harvard and Stanford did. So they're looking at 2019 to 2023. You'll see Oregon had the largest decline, which meant we did not rebound post-pandemic. Only Alabama's kids were performing better after the pandemic than they were before. Most states in 2023 were still performing worse than they were prior to the pandemic. But the problem is we were performing so much worse than everybody else. And then in reading, again, these states that I keep talking about, Illinois is on this list now, Mississippi, Louisiana, only kids in those states were performing better post-pandemic than they were before. But again, Oregon, we have a long ways to go. So that's the data I was alluding to. And these states that are performing better, it's not rocket science. I mean, here's Tennessee, you'll see on the reading outcomes, in Mississippi, I talked about Louisiana, Illinois, around the tutoring, like they're doing a statewide thing together. There's a lot having to do with leadership here.
Okay, and here's a question. Why do you think we can't have a state structure to do some of this work? What causes that to be the case?
I think anything is possible. I think we could have a state structure to do this work. I just think it takes a culture shift. I mean, I was looking at that we haven't had before, and so unfortunately, I mean, I think Oregon, around education outcomes, we fare pretty similarly around our economic development outcomes. You know, there was just what was it, Echo Northwest did the state of the state last week that got reported in the paper. And I think when you look at sort of common indicators of strong economic development, Oregon is generally at the bottom. And I would make the case, you know, it's for the similar reasons that we're at the bottom around education. It's not to say that's not changeable, but it does take a cultural shift that our state is not used to, which is really strong leadership with flexibility at the local level, but not letting everybody just sort of decide individually how they're going to attend to teaching kids to read. And that leadership and that statewide focus is something that we don't do very much here, whether it's in the education arena or in the economic development arena. So it's possible. I think it is possible, but it takes a concerted effort to do something differently. I can talk a little bit more about the Department of Ed if there's interest, but I don't know, we might start losing people. We might start dropping like flies. Talk about the Department of Ed. So I'll leave it there for now. And if people want to go more into the Department of Ed, let Eric know. Was there any other questions there, Eric?
Nope, there aren't any more.
Okay. Okay, so I'll leave this note on the Department of Ed. So as Eric said in my bio, I worked at the Department of Ed from 2012 to when my daughter was born in 2015, when I decided I couldn't commute to Salem anymore. And I worked with Rob Saxton, who was our first state superintendent. So prior to 2013, we had an appointed state superintendent, and our state board of ed is also appointed. I said appointed state superintendent. Sorry, prior to 2013, we had an elected state superintendent, and then legislation passed that made that appointed. Maybe because I was part of it, I'm obviously biased, but I saw we made a lot of big shifts in 2013 at the Department of Ed when Rob came in to be more directive, more focused around children's outcomes. I don't see that same focus right now with the Department of Education. And I think there are things we could do by looking at other models for how departments of education and state board of ed, how are they elected? Are they appointed? In order to try to create some more accountability within the Department of Ed. And I get a little worried right now because we did move to an appointed state superintendent. And as I mentioned, we have appointed state board of ed members. There's not much accountability from the state board of ed back to the Department of Education. And so the dynamic that we set up, appointed and appointed, means, like I said, there's just I think more accountability is needed. Now, would that change the culture? Probably not dramatically, but is it something we should look at? Maybe. If we want to have a stronger Department of Ed that can lead and support this implementation, it's worth taking a look at other state models, I think, around that.
Okay, I've got a follow-up question. Without a federal Department of Education, or at least a robust federal role, do you think ODE can take on a more robust role?
I mean, they have the authority to take on a more robust role. I think the question will be, do they have the leadership to do it? So I was really surprised when I was at the department how much authority we had. So the department is governed by something called Division 22, which is in their rulemaking authority. We had, and the current department still has a lot of authority. If they wanted to lengthen, for instance, the length of the school year, they could. I mean, they could do that right now without legislation. Now, will they? Probably not, but could they? Yes. And so there's a lot of authority that sits at the Department of Ed. You don't need to wait for more legislation to come through. But then it gets back to that other question a little bit earlier, right? Which is, what's the cultural shift necessary to get the Department of Ed to take on that leadership that's necessary? So the authority exists. And if we want to get the department to use it, I think it's both advocacy and also looking at some of the structures that we set up within the Department of Ed, namely the relationship between the Department of Ed, state suit, and the state board of ed. Yeah.
Okay, I don't see any more questions. Anyone else?
All right. Well, I would just say we'd love to have you, folks who are on this panel, if you're interested in joining us, both to advocate for early literacy, but also accountability. So
when I was talking about money that sits outside of the state school fund, dedicated to research delaying strategies that have to be used on those strategies, we don't do that very often in Oregon. We did that with Measure 98 for the first time, and then we're trying to do that with early literacy. We could really use some advocacy around that. So you can use this QR code to join our list and stay updated. If you are interested in getting more involved in that, please let me know. I have my email at the very top slide, and I'll get these slides out to Eric. And then, like I said, it can't just be strong legislation that exists at a state level. We then have to support the implementation, which is what we'll try to follow through on into next year. So I appreciate everybody's time taking a deep dive on this, and I think it absolutely is possible to shift this around, but it's going to take some statewide focus.
Okay. Well, thanks a lot, Sarah. Really appreciate your coming to talk to us today.
All right. Thank you, everybody. Enjoy your Monday.
Bye.
Bye.